The year was 1843. Wethersfield, Connecticut was a quiet town known for its cobbled streets, horse-drawn wagons, and honest working people. Life moved slowly here. Sundays were for prayer, winters for survival, and summers for planting. But the town's slow rhythm was disrupted in early March when the first death came. A death that no one understood, but everyone felt. His name was Thomas Bray, a seasoned blacksmith, a man built from iron and faith. He was 62 years old, strong as a tree and just as rooted in the community. For decades he had worked in his modest forge at the edge of town, shoeing horses, fixing wagon wheels, and shaping the tools that kept Wethersfield running. People said you could hear the steady clang of his hammer echoing across the valley like a heartbeat, but that heartbeat would soon go silent. It was a Tuesday morning. Crisp air still carried the bite of late winter, but the sky was blue, clearer than usual. Some townsfolk would later recall Thomas had risen early, as always. His apprentice, young Ellie Potter, found him at work before sunrise, humming a hymn under his breath. Nothing seemed unusual at first, but by mid-morning Thomas grew quiet. Not the usual kind of silence that comes with concentration. This was different. He was staring at something, his hammer frozen mid-air, his mouth slightly open. Ellie called out to him, but Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the anvil in front of him, and then Ellie saw it too. Perched atop the anvil was a raven, jet black, unblinking and unmoving. It was almost surreal. Birds didn't come into the forge. The heat, the noise, it would scare off even the bravest of creatures. But this one sat like it belonged. It stared directly at Thomas. Not flinching, not shifting, Ellie felt a coldness rise in the room, not from the weather, but something else, something that made his chest tighten, and just as suddenly as it had appeared, the raven took off. A single caw echoed through the forge, and it was gone. Thomas dropped his hammer. He sat on a wooden stool, sweating profusely despite the morning chill. He whispered, "It knows," over and over again. Ellie rushed to fetch help, but by the time he returned with neighbors, Thomas was slumped over, his head resting on the anvil where the bird had perched. The doctor said it was his heart, sudden failure. But others weren't so sure. His wife, Margaret, said he had no history of illness. He was strong as a horse, no complaints, no symptoms. He never even caught a cold. But she did say one thing that haunted her. The night before his death, he'd woken up from a nightmare, drenched in sweat. When she asked what was wrong, he whispered, "There's something in the wind, something's coming, but I don't know for who." The town was shaken, not just because Thomas Bray had died, but how he died. Strong one day, gone the next, and the raven, no one saw it again. But soon, more stories of strange sightings began to circulate. A woman saw two black birds circling the chapel. A child swore a shadow moved without anyone to cast it. And Margaret, 3 nights after her husband's passing, found a single black feather on their kitchen table, though the windows were shut tight. Some claimed it was superstition. Others believed it was a warning. But in the weeks that followed, one thing became clear. No two people in town would die the same way. Each death would carry its own mark, its own omen, its own fear. And Thomas Bray was the first. Death rarely arrives with a trumpet blast. More often it whispers, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in symbols, and sometimes in birds we were never meant to see. Thomas Bray's death reminds us that life is never guaranteed, not even for the strongest among us. The warning signs are often small, a feeling in your gut, a word left unsaid, a strange silence in your daily routine. We often ignore these signs, caught in the busy rhythm of living. But every now and then, a raven lands in our life, not to curse us, but to wake us up. Because the real tragedy is not in dying suddenly, it's in living blindly. Her name was Clara Wilkins, and by the spring of 1843, she had become something of a curiosity in the town of Wethersfield, Connecticut. She was only 23, but people said she had an old soul. Quiet, observant, always sketching something in the corner of a room while conversations floated around her like background music. She lived alone after losing her parents to consumption 3 years earlier. Her home, a modest cottage near the apple orchard, had been turned into a private studio where she spent most of her days painting. Clara never took commissions, never sold her work. She claimed that her paintings weren't made for money. She She said they came to her in dreams, and that some things were not meant to be bought. Despite her isolation, Clara's name often came up in whispers, especially after Thomas Bray's strange and sudden death. It wasn't that she was involved, but that she had once painted him, standing alone in a field, a black bird perched on his shoulder. Long before anyone saw the real raven in his forge, people started asking, how did she know? One morning in late April, Clara walked into the general store and purchased 5 fresh canvases, more oil than she'd ever bought at once, and brushes she claimed she would only use once. When asked what she was working on, she paused and said, almost under her breath, a vision of what becomes of a town that forgets to feel. That night, she started her final painting. For days, her chimney smoked endlessly. No one saw her at church, the market, or even the riverbank, where she used to sit and sketch strangers. She stopped answering knocks at the door. Some assumed she had taken ill. Others feared the worst. But on the 6th day, the smoke stopped, and the silence became unsettling. Her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Grafton, finally walked over and knocked. No answer. She opened the door, calling Clara's name. The smell of oil paint filled the house. Brushes were scattered on the floor, the hearth had long gone cold, and in the center of the room sat the unfinished painting, and Clara's body, still peaceful as if sleeping, was lying beside it. No blood, no bruises, no struggle, just stillness. The doctor was baffled. Her heart simply stopped. He said, but when her belongings were sorted, something eerie became clear. The painting showed a field of wheat. Not golden and swaying, but gray and dead, as if frozen in time. In the center were several figures drowning, sinking into the dirt like quicksand. Their faces were blurred, except one, a young woman's face, frozen in terror, with Clara's exact features, stared back from the canvas. It was her. She had painted her own death, and the painting wasn't even finished. Clara had only completed half the figures. The town was rattled. Some insisted it was coincidence. Others whispered that she had seen too much, that she was sensitive to the other side. But those closest to her remembered what she often said when asked about her art. I don't create these images. I uncover them, as if they were already there, buried beneath the canvas. In her journal, found in a drawer near her bedside, her final entry read, each death has a different shape, but the same shadow. We're being watched, not by ghosts, but by truths we refuse to face. My hands ache because the future isn't paint, it's pain. I only wish I had more time. What did she mean by more time? Was she trying to warn the town through her art? Did she know her end was near? Or did the very act of painting the future pull her into it? No one knows. But for years after, no one dared paint in that house. The unfinished canvas was hidden away in the back of the town chapel, and those who claimed to have looked at it closely said the figures on the canvas began to look familiar, as if the painting continued on its own. Clara Wilkins was not a prophet. She was a mirror. She showed us what we try not to see, that death doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it comes with silence, with disconnection, with the refusal to listen to what your spirit is trying to say. Too many people die without ever expressing what burns inside them, their talents, their warnings, their visions. Clara's story reminds us that your gift is not for you alone. It's a message, a map, a mirror for others. Don't silence your creativity. Don't wait for the world to understand before you speak your truth. Your unfinished work might be the warning someone else needs to live. In every town, there's always one voice people turn to in times of confusion, grief, or fear. In Wethersfield, Connecticut, during the uneasy spring of 1843, that voice belonged to Reverend Malcolm Dean. He was not just the town's preacher, he was its compass. A tall man with kind eyes and a booming voice that could quiet a crying infant or stir a cold heart to repentance. Reverend Dean was a man of devotion and discipline. He had served the Wethersfield Church for 18 years. Never missed a sermon, never skipped a visit to the sick or elderly. To many, he was the voice of God, but in 1843, even that voice would fall silent. It began the Sunday after the funeral of Clara Wilkins, the young painter who had mysteriously died next to her haunting, unfinished canvas. The townspeople gathered, shaken, unsure of what to believe. Whispers of omens and shadows had begun to replace their usual small talk. Reverend Dean stepped up to the pulpit that morning, his Bible clutched tightly, the air inside the chapel tense and expectant. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out, not a whisper, not a breath, just silence. At first, people thought he was emotional, grieving, or perhaps struck by the weight of the moment, but his lips kept moving, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to form words. Yet no sound came. His wife, Eliza, rushed to him. They brought water. They prayed. A physician was called, but the Reverend had lost his voice completely without any injury or illness. He could write. He could walk. He could even hum. But when he tried to speak, his throat seized, as if some invisible hand were clutching his words before they left his mouth. The congregation left the chapel in confusion. That evening, Reverend Dean tried to write out the sermon he had intended to preach. He sat at his desk by candlelight, trembling as he scribbled words onto the page, but the moment his pen touched the subject of death or spirits or the recent events in town, his hands began to tremble violently, the ink smeared, the letters bent into illegible shapes, his pen snapped, he dropped to his knees and wept. That was the last day he entered the church by daylight. Over the next 3 nights, strange things occurred. At exactly midnight, the church bell rang out across Wethersfield. Once the first night, twice the second, and 3 times the third night, each time more frantic than the last. People gathered outside in the cold to witness it. The chapel was empty. No lights, no movement, but the bell swayed, screaming into the night air. Some said it sounded like a warning, others like a cry for help. On the 4th night, the truth was found. A farmer named Paul Yates, curious and worried, ventured into the church tower just before midnight. There, lying on the floor beneath the bell's rope, was Reverend Dean, dead. Eyes closed, hands folded, face peaceful. But beside him was a torn piece of parchment, barely legible. I tried to warn them. The time is not near. The time is inside us. They won't listen, not with words, only with fear. The autopsy revealed no cause of death. No trauma, no disease. His heart had simply stopped, just like Clara, just like Thomas Bray. But what haunted the townspeople most was what Eliza found days later, tucked into the folds of his sermon notes, an earlier version of his final message, written weeks before he lost his voice. It read, "If we continue to ignore the whispers, the signs will scream, and when the screams are not heard, the bells will ring, for us and for the ones who still have time." After his death, the church bells remained still. Forever, Reverend Dean's story is not just a tale of mystery. It's a reminder of what happens when the truth becomes too heavy to carry alone. There are moments in life when your soul knows something before your voice does. When your instincts are screaming, but society tells you to whisper. When you feel the urgency to warn, to lead, to protect, but no one wants to hear what's uncomfortable. Sometimes your silence says more than your words ever could. Reverend Dean tried to speak, but the message was too heavy, too sacred, or perhaps too late, and so the bell rang for him, not as a symbol of death, but as a final alarm for the living. Are you ignoring your own inner warnings? Is there something your heart is trying to say, but fear is choking your voice? Don't wait until the bell tolls for you. Speak now, act now, leave now. June 6, 1843, began like any other day in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Sunlight breaking through morning mist, roosters crowing, farmers rising with aching backs to tend to their crops. The town had been through an unsettling spring, unexplainable deaths, whispers of omens, and eyes that looked more tired than usual, but summer brought a strange kind of hope. The wheat fields had ripened. Gardens bloomed. It was, by all appearances, the season of life, until everything froze. It was Eliza Harper, a widow who lived near the edge of town, who noticed it first. She stepped outside before dawn to gather herbs from her garden, but what she found stopped her breath. A layer of frost so thick it glimmered like glass. Her tomatoes, once bright and plump, now drooped, encased in a crystalline web of ice. The ground beneath her feet crunched like snow, yet the air felt no colder than a typical summer morning. She thought she was dreaming or mad until the neighbors started screaming. One by one, townsfolk emerged from their homes to find their gardens dead. Corn stalks were cracked and limp, beans turned gray, flowers slumped over like mourners at a grave. Even the mighty oak near the chapel had frozen leaves that fell like shards when touched. And then there was the river. Usually humming with movement, the surface of the Connecticut River lay still, coated with a thin sheet of ice. Fish floated near the banks, frozen mid-swim. There had been no snow, no wind, no explanation. Some called it an act of God, others muttered the word curse. The town physician, Dr. Howard Milton, claimed it was a weather anomaly, perhaps a strange convergence of wind, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. But even he admitted he'd never seen anything like it in his lifetime. More unsettling than the frost, however, were the sounds people heard that day. Several residents reported whispers on the wind, low voices that seemed to murmur just below the edge of understanding. Some said it sounded like praying, others claimed it was weeping. Children cried, livestock refused to eat, and birds refused to sing. Something had shifted, not just in nature, but in the air, in the very rhythm of the town. By sundown, the town council gathered at the chapel to discuss what had happened, and that's when the deaths began again. The first was Henry Cobb, a farmer who refused to leave his frozen field. He stood motionless in the cold soil for hours, claiming he heard his wife, who had died 2 years prior, calling his name from beneath the ground. He was found hours later in his well, having drowned in 2 feet of water. Next came Abigail Monroe, a schoolteacher, struck by lightning on a cloudless evening while walking home from the chapel. Witnesses say the flash came without warning, and the sky remained perfectly clear afterward. And then Peter Langston, a recluse and trapper, was discovered buried beneath his own root cellar. The door was still bolted from the outside. There were no signs of forced entry. The dirt was compacted over him, as if he had been pulled into the earth. 3 deaths, 3 signs, 1 frozen day. No one understood what tied it all together until a diary surfaced. It belonged to Reverend Malcolm Dean, who had died just weeks earlier after mysteriously losing his voice. In the final pages of his journal, he had written about an old scripture he had read in the early days of his ministry, about a season when the earth shall harden itself against those who ignore the voice of truth. He warned that when the living forget how to listen, nature itself will remind them. The townspeople began to fear that the land, the weather, even time itself, had turned against them, not randomly, but deliberately. The Day of the Frozen Garden is more than a chilling chapter in Wethersfield's dark year. It's a warning not about frost, but about failing to listen to the world around you, to your inner compass, and to the signs that something is wrong long before catastrophe arrives. Too often, we treat life like summer, abundant, warm, forgiving. We assume we'll always have tomorrow to apologize, to act, to fix, to speak. But life doesn't always give warnings in language we understand. Sometimes it speaks through silence, through a child's question, through a dream, through the sudden stillness of what used to bloom. The people of Wethersfield ignored the earlier signs, the raven, the painting, the bell. So nature had to speak next, and it did so in the most shocking way possible, by taking life and freezing it in time. So ask yourself, what warnings are you ignoring today? What garden of your life is slowly freezing while you pretend everything is fine? What truth have you buried, hoping it never thaws? Because when you don't listen, sometimes the world speaks louder, and when it does, you won't forget the day everything froze. In the eerie summer of 1843, while the town of Wethersfield, Connecticut, stood frozen in fear, both metaphorically and, as they'd recently witnessed, literally, one voice kept rising above the silence. It wasn't a preacher, it wasn't a town leader or a scholar, it was a 9-year-old orphan named Mira Carson. Mira had been living in the Wethersfield orphanage for 4 years, ever since her parents vanished during a supply trip to Hartford in 1839. No wagon was ever found, no bodies recovered, just silence. The townspeople said it was bandits or wild animals, but Mira had always said something different. They were taken by the wind, she once whispered to another child. And not the normal kind, the kind that carries secrets. From the very beginning, Mira was different. She didn't speak much during the day, but at night, she would sit upright in bed and talk. Not sleep talk, but deliberate, clear statements that chilled the spine of anyone who overheard. Caretakers would find her staring out the window, speaking in a flat tone about things no child should know. The church bells will ring, but not for weddings. The ice will come before the harvest. Everyone dies in a different way, but all because they forgot who they were. Some thought she was traumatized, others claimed she was cursed, but one thing became increasingly clear: Mira wasn't guessing. She was remembering things that hadn't happened yet. By late June, as the town tried to recover from the frozen garden, Mira became more vocal. She started drawing pictures with charcoal, simple yet haunting images: a field of empty chairs, a black bird sitting on every rooftop, and the town square completely deserted except for a circle of faceless people holding hands around a burning clock. When asked where she got these ideas, she replied simply, "It's what I saw before I came here." "What do you mean?" one caretaker asked. "Before I was born, rumors began to spread. Some adults avoided her altogether. Others tried to get answers from her in secret. One day, the town librarian asked her gently, 'What do you see when you look at me?' Mira tilted her head, paused, and said, 'You die in a chair, facing the window, but you're smiling. You see something you've been waiting for.'" That same librarian passed away peacefully in her reading chair 2 weeks later, facing the library window just as Mira had described. And yet no one stopped her. No one protected her. They feared her, but they didn't understand her. 1 week later, Mira vanished. On the morning of July 12, 1843, the orphanage awoke to find her bed empty, her shoes placed neatly beside the window, and a trail of black feathers leading out to the woods. Search parties were formed, dogs were brought in, but no scent, no prints, no trace was ever found. All that remained was a final drawing left on her bed, a picture of the entire town of Wethersfield abandoned. The streets were cracked, the sky dark, and a single word written beneath in a child's handwriting: "Forgotten." Some claimed she was taken. Others believed she had run into the woods and died from exposure or wild animals. But there were no bones, no blood, and the strange thing was the woods near Wethersfield had always been thick with birdsong. But after Mira vanished, the birds left. It became a dead forest, still watching. Years later, those who remembered her would say the same thing: she wasn't warning us, she was reminding us. They believed Mira had been born with memories of a time that hadn't happened yet, memories meant to save others. But instead of being embraced, she was pushed aside by a town that didn't want to believe in the impossible. Mira Carson's story is not one of fear, it's a story of missed opportunity. So many of us are gifted with vision, dreams, instincts, ideas, and inner voices that whisper things we don't fully understand. But instead of listening, we bury them. We label them weird, unrealistic, or unwelcome. We silence the parts of ourselves that could protect, guide, or even heal others. Mira wasn't just a child with dreams, she was a messenger, a reminder that sometimes the most innocent voices carry the greatest truths. And when those voices are ignored, entire futures can collapse. Ask yourself, what is your soul trying to tell you? What have you seen, felt, or dreamed that others dismiss? Are you running from a truth that was given to you? To share, because the greatest tragedy is not that Mira disappeared. The tragedy is that no one listened before she did, and now Wethersfield, the town she tried to save, exists only in the faded pages of a forgotten history, and the distant sound of a girl who remembered the future. By the end of 1843, the once bustling town of Wethersfield, Connecticut, had become a ghost of itself. The gardens were dead. The church bell had fallen silent. The children whispered of shadows. Entire families had packed their belongings and disappeared in the middle of the night. Doors were left open, food still on tables, pets abandoned. The town wasn't dying. It was unraveling, piece by piece. And yet there was no plague, no fire, no war, just death after death, each stranger than the last, each cloaked in mystery, and each whispering the same silent message: "You forgot something." In December, a historian named Joseph Mallory arrived from Hartford. He was young, skeptical, and curious. Having heard rumors of Wethersfield's cursed year, he thought it would make a fine article for the regional paper, another tale of small town hysteria. He packed his journals, maps, and measuring tools. But what he discovered was nothing he could explain. He arrived to find a town that felt hollow, as if it had exhaled and never inhaled again. Shutters hung loosely. Wind passed through broken windows like whispers. Only a few souls remained, and those who did refused to speak of what had happened. When asked about the deaths, they would look away or mumble prayers. But there was one man who spoke to Mallory, a former schoolteacher named Walter Griggs, half mad and missing 2 fingers. Walter led Mallory to the back of the town's chapel, past overgrown weeds and rotted wooden fences, to a part of the graveyard that wasn't marked on any official records. There, behind the chapel, lay a large patch of sunken earth, crudely covered in dirt and loose stones. A mass grave. Mallory counted 17 wooden crosses, each weather beaten, none with names, just symbols, circles, triangles, crosses, and in some cases, what looked like scratch marks carved by hand. Walter pointed and whispered, "They weren't buried by families, they were buried by the town, all of them, died differently, but all of them died afraid." Joseph Mallory returned to the chapel and began interviewing the remaining residents, scouring their journals, sifting through newspaper clippings, reading every sermon note, every town record. And what emerged from the fragments was a single thread of truth. Each person who had died that year had ignored something inside themselves, a dream, a vision, a warning, and when they did, death came for them, but not in the same way. Some drowned in wells, some froze in summer, some were struck by lightning under clear skies. One woman disappeared into the woods and left behind only her shoes. Another man collapsed after seeing a raven no one else saw. Mallory's notes recorded all of it. He wrote furiously, trying to find meaning. He said the town didn't suffer from illness, but from neglect, not of each other, but of their inner voice, their intuition, their soul. And just before he left Wethersfield forever, he wrote a final letter to a friend in Hartford. It read, "I have seen the unthinkable, a town that did not burn, yet turned to ash, a people who did not fight a war, yet lost everything. These were not curses, nor coincidences. This was the slow death of conscience. The truth was never shouted, it was whispered and ignored. The people of Wethersfield didn't die the same way, because they didn't live the same way, but they all shared one thing. They knew what they should have done, and they didn't do it." He ended the letter with a line that historians would quote for generations. It wasn't that they were cursed, it was that they never truly lived. The letter was never published in any newspaper. Mallory burned his journals, resigned from the Historical Society, and vanished from public life. He reportedly moved to a remote cabin and lived alone until his death. His last words, according to a local nurse, were, "Don't bury your truth. It will dig its way out. As for the mass grave, it remains unmarked to this day. The land around it grows no grass. Animals avoid it, and locals, what few remain, refuse to speak of it, except in hushed voices on stormy nights. The mass grave wasn't filled with people who simply died. It was filled with souls who never finished their stories. Each death was different, but the regret was the same. This final chapter of Wethersfield is not just a tale of horror, it is a mirror. One that asks you to look inward and confront a simple, terrifying question. What part of yourself are you burying alive? We often silence the truth in us, our passions, our warnings, our convictions, because they're inconvenient, uncomfortable, or misunderstood. But silence doesn't save us. It only delays the reckoning. Speak your truth. Live it. Because the longer you bury what matters, the deeper the grave you're digging. And one day, it may be your name carved into the stone without ever having been spoken aloud. The day everyone died differently wasn't about a curse or a ghost. It was about a forgotten truth, that death only seems random when life is lived without intention. Wethersfield faded into history, but its message echoes in every heart that dares to listen. Live now. Fear less, become more.